We will continue this morning with the next technical block focusing on climate finance. Once again, communities are engaged and the science is sound. Then conservation turns to scale. Climate finance, whether through carbon markets, public-private partnerships, or mixed models, can unlock high-impact community-based solutions. This fourth technical block brings together leaders in finance and investment to explore how blue carbon projects in Latin America and the Caribbean can move from pilot to platform, from promise to transformation. Our panelists are Diána Denke from Fair Carbon, joining us remotely, Adrián Flores Aguilar from NDC Partnership, and Amy Schmid from Conservation International, who will be joining us remotely too. After the individual presentations, we will invite our panelists to return to the stage for a discussion. This session will be moderated by Mr. Tobias Jackson, Senior Research Associate at the University of Bristol. We begin with Diána Denke, co-founder and executive director of Fair Carbon. Mrs. Denke leads Fair Carbon, a Swiss-based nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and restoring marine and coastal ecosystems through high-integrity carbon and nature markets. Her career includes experience in impact investing, sustainability leadership, and environmental consulting. She previously led a climate and nature practice at COIS and has worked with several firms advising public, private, and nonprofit clients in Europe, the Americas, and Southeast Asia. Her presentation is titled The Blue Catalyst Fund, Risk Reduction and Scaling of High-Integrity Blue Carbon Projects for Coastal Resilience.
Hello, everyone. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so good to meet you. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Fair Carbon. Fair Carbon is a Swiss non-profit organization working to scale a high-integrity blue carbon market. And we provide the infrastructure, so the tools, the training, and the financing needed to help restore coastal ecosystems in a way that deliver real outcomes for communities, biodiversity, and the climate. Later on, we will have our policy lead, Ceci Pertus, speak about policy, and she also introduces a little bit more in detail what we do at Fair Carbon. Right now, I want to focus this point on the financing element. So as I mentioned, we're working with developers, communities, investors, and governments to lower the technical, financial, and regulatory barriers that prevent a fair and high-integrity blue carbon market from scaling. And through our work, we've realized that there is a big gap in the market when it comes to funding. A lot of projects are struggling to get funded or even get to scale. And this is really a structural problem in the market that we are hoping to address with the Blue Catalyst Fund that was recently launched. So I will tell you a little bit more about what this fund is and what it is doing. Next slide, please. So this is probably the slide I need to spend less time with you, as you're all very familiar with the benefits of coastal and marine ecosystems. The one point I would like to highlight here is that we hear a lot about the voluntary carbon markets and how carbon finance is a key source for restoring and protecting coastal ecosystems, but also there has been quite a bit of frustration with the way that it's been working. Our point here is that nevertheless, it's a major funding mechanism. The voluntary carbon markets is projected to a large expansion over the next decade, and the scale of that varies between which source you're looking at. But if you're looking at the blue carbon segment of the voluntary carbon market, you can see that it's still a tiny fraction of the credits issued, only 0.2% of total BCM issuance, it goes to blue carbon. And we believe that this is a real shame because there is so much value that could be unlocked for climate, nature, people. So what we're trying to address here is to up this number significantly. Next slide, please. So what we understood is, despite the growing demand for blue carbon per se, still this market remained small in the last years. And we believe that there are some structural challenges that make it so that the market cannot really grow. And these challenges are actually visible both on the supply side, so both on the project developing side, and the demand side, which is an investor and funding perspective. So the supply side challenges include a lack of technical expertise, and we have seen Dr. Steve Crooks talk about the importance of scientifically led project restoration and approaches. 80% of blue carbon restoration projects fail due to a lack of scientific background in the way that they approach the project. So we believe that that kind of scientific, rigorous methodology and technical expertise is essential, but it is also something that is pretty scarce. What we have understood is blue carbon experts are a rare species of the earth. So we're looking at how we can utilize the real expertise of companies such as Silvestrum and others to help projects actually scale. The other problem is there are high project development costs and a lot of inefficiencies. And this mainly comes from the fact that the information around where to find that kind of technical guidance and expertise is hard to access, and it's fragmented. So even with the projects that we have come across, many of them cycle through a lot of carbon experts and consultants before they land with someone like Silvestrum or Terra Carbon, because they simply don't know who are the people that have real expertise on the ground and that can help them develop that project documentation in a most efficient way. So often money is lost and time is lost in this process. And there is also, as I mentioned, this gap in funding where many projects are able to get some form of philanthropic capital or grants to get going, do a scoping study, do some kind of pilot here and there. But that money usually is nowhere near enough to actually get a project all the way to accreditation and then to investment. So what we're seeing is you need about, on average, maybe $500,000 for that whole process. And that is not something that many of these developers have on their balance sheets or can access easily. So all of this actually leads to a lack of investable pipeline. But there are also challenges on the demand side and the investor side. And despite a growing interest in blue carbon, the due diligence costs remain really high. And this is due to a lack of credibility or lack of transparent database, misalignment with investor requirements. We often talk about the fact that investors want turnkey, ready-made, investable, AAA rated projects, but that's not what's available today. We need to get there. And then there is also regulatory complexity. Navigating this legal landscape around blue carbon can be tough, and the global frameworks are evolving, constantly shifting. Countries are in the process of figuring out how to regulate around blue carbon. And all of this actually leads to the fact that investors still perceive this as high risk. And so even though we see a growing number of nature funds and carbon funds on the space, the capital committed remains quite low. So without addressing these obstacles, blue carbon will fail to scale and leaving a vast potential of coastal and marine ecosystems underutilized in climate mitigation and adaptation. So that led us to think about, and next slide please, that something needs to be done here. Like some of those challenges could be solved. And we were looking at, okay, what kind of these catalytic funding programs are available, what kind of accelerator programs are available, and what are they achieving in the space. And what we have come to understand is funds that currently exist either have a limited stage-specific funding, which means that they are getting involved with projects only for a period of time, but it doesn't necessarily allow them a full kind of support to get to accreditation and to then actually investment, and which is the case of the IUCN-run Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility and the BCAF, or they just simply don't have the specific blue carbon expertise. And blue carbon is a highly technical field, so you cannot just take learnings from the terrestrial carbon expertise and apply it. And so there is a market gap for an accelerator to exist which specializes on blue carbon and brings the best and brightest in the world around the technical expertise, but also provides an end-to-end support to projects, taking them from feasibility all the way to investment. And this is what we're aiming to achieve. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, you did say it. So with the Blue Catalyst Fund, we provide a structured program to de-risk, finance, and scale high-integrity carbon projects. And some of the pain points that we're aiming to address is, we think that an end-to-end program is critical. Even if a project gets to accreditation, it doesn't mean that they will be in a position or a space where they will be able to secure funding successfully. Actually, when we engage with investors, the numbers are pretty gruesome. We hear that in some cases, some of these carbon funds reject 90% of the proposals they receive. And how can that be? The reason there is because the investors need to speak in a language that they understand. Like they're looking at risk profiles, they're looking at profit and loss statements, balance sheet statements, and it is a tall order to ask from a project developer to also have a deep financial expertise in-house alongside with all the carbon expertise. So in this Blue Catalyst Fund, we are going to do that end-to-end capacity building and provide support with blue carbon technical experts along with financial advisory services that actually take the project up until the moment where they can get invested in. The other element which I mentioned is this special blue carbon focus. We have partnered with 3 companies who are vetted blue carbon experts to minimize the risk of the projects, to strengthen local capacity and ensure alignment with the highest quality standards. Mark mentioned the high quality blue carbon principles and guidance. We are applying all of that into this work. So this means that the projects can actually be de-risked at the end of the program. And we apply a milestones-based funding, which means that the projects are given grant funding, but it is a recoverable grant, and they need to repay it once they secure the investment. This makes our interests aligned with the projects. We both want them to succeed. We both want them to get that money. And we also don't burden the balance sheet of the project early on. So in case a project fails during the acceleration program, there is no need to repay anything. And then lastly, the repayment model allows us to create a revolving fund. We know that donor contributions, philanthropic capital is a scarce resource. Everyone is prying for it. And so we believe that we need to use it more efficiently. And every dollar of catalytic funding that comes to the fund has the potential to be recycled and then spent again to finance future cohorts. Next slide, please. So just telling you a little bit of the story of how this came about and the story of Fair Carbon. So we have run 2 programs before. One is creation of the Blue Carbon Academy with the vision to democratize access to blue carbon knowledge and address that gap in technical expertise. And here we have, this is an online resource. You can find it on the internet and totally free. Again, here we partnered with experts on specific modules, and you can read about what a project needs to do to assess feasibility, what are the steps needed during the PDD process. We provide a lot of tools, templates, resources, and guidance, including how to create a carbon model, a carbon curve, how to create profit and loss statement, to actually up the knowledge of projects. And we will rely on this heavily during the accelerator program as well. But we combine this kind of knowledge that is housed in the Blue Carbon Academy with hands-on guidance from vetted blue carbon experts and specialist transaction support. So each project will be matched with a technical service provider, and those service providers will also then go to the project side, help conduct the field assessment, set the carbon baselines, and ensure that the project is designed to the highest standards possible. The second program that we have run last year is a pilot program where we worked with 7 projects around the world and helping them basically through this whole accreditation process. What we realized is that most projects struggled to advance to investment readiness because they were struggling to get funding, or there were delays in getting that funding. Like some of them may have been granted some funding, but they had to wait for months or even a year to just receive it. So this is how we understood that we need to provide a holistic solution that includes both the early stage funding, the technical support, and the transaction advisory services, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. So this Blue Catalyst Fund is a real collaboration between a lot of organizations. We would not be able to do this on our own. We partnered with Finance Earth, who is a London-based financing advisor, an award-winning social enterprise who have run a lot of accelerator programs in the UK. And it is them who will provide this kind of funding, transaction advisory support. And likewise, we also partnered with the best-in-class technical blue carbon consultants such as Silvestrum, that you all know. Dr. Steve Crooks is here, Terra Carbon, another leading advisory firm based in blue carbon, and Nika, a Singapore-based company delivering carbon technical services. So we will hope that this multidisciplinary team can provide the comprehensive services needed for projects to successfully raise investment and deliver maximum impact. I also want to say that we're very ambitious. Like today, the time it takes for projects to get to accreditation on average is 3 to 5 years from the beginning to end. We want to halve this time. We want to take projects from pre-feasibility to accreditation in 2 years, and we add half a year of transaction advisory support, helping the projects prepare for due diligence, introducing them to investors, helping them negotiating the terms of the agreement, and making sure that a deal is actually struck at the end of the program. We will have 2 entry points to the Blue Catalyst Fund, this pre-feasibility model, which I just explained, but there will also be a fast track where we take post-feasibility projects, and there we aim to finish the program in 1 year and adding half a year of transaction advisory. So suddenly, instead of 3 to 5 years, you're looking at 1.5 to 2.5 years of end-to-end support. Next slide, please. So our goal with this fund is to drive systemic change and make sure that we're able to restore and expand the protection and restoration of coastal marine ecosystems. I do have to say that right now we are only considering mangrove projects, so that is the remit of the fund. We do want to see a growing pipeline of projects come out that are backed by science and they adhere to the highest quality standards and that deliver measurable impact. And we want to see coastal livelihoods transform. This is also one of the ethos of Fair Carbon that is reflected in our name, Fair. We really think that people need to be put first. Those coastal communities need to be the primary beneficiaries of any kind of carbon project. And we really encourage the projects to be co-designed and co-developed by local communities in hand. And we hope to catalyze private investment and create an evergreen scalable model that can support the growth of the market on the whole. Next slide, please. So if all goes to plan, what we're seeing is we are seeking 6 million funding in philanthropic capital, and that would unlock 300 million of private capital investment by 2035. It would help us establish a permanent funding infrastructure for blue carbon. And under the current assumptions, this would mean we can support 110 projects and 180,000 hectares of land protected and restored, and 50 million CO2 avoided or removed over the lifetime of projects, with 250 million local community benefit sharing. So this is our plan. Ambitious, I know, but we're very excited. We just launched it 2 weeks ago. We've already received around 80 applications, 70 of which are actually legit. So we are in the process of evaluating it, and we will launch the first cohort this October. So if you do know of any project that could be applicable, I would still encourage you to sign up or follow our news, because we will be opening future call for applicants as well. Thank you so much for your attention.
Muchas gracias a la señora Denke. A continuación escucharemos a Adrián Flores Aguilar, quien es especialista en finanzas climáticas de la NDC Partnership. El señor Flores cuenta con más de una década de experiencia asesorando a gobiernos e instituciones en América Latina y el Caribe sobre mitigación, adaptación y construcción de resiliencia climática. En la NDC Partnership apoya la implementación de estrategias de financiamiento, iniciativas de intercambio de conocimientos y la creación de alianzas con bancos de desarrollo, donantes y el sector privado. Su presentación se titula Movilización de inversiones para ecosistemas de carbono azul, un marco para la toma de decisiones. Vamos a recibirlo con un cordial saludo, por favor.
Buenos días, permítame nada más probar esto.
Okay, good morning to you all. Just allow me to test this.
¿Y ahora cómo me devuelvo?
And how do I get back?
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Para mí
Okay, thank you very much. For me, it's really a pleasure being here with you guys. Celebrating the opening of these spaces for exchange. And as my colleague was talking, I'm Adrián Flores. I'm a finance associate for climate. And I'm going to talk to you today about the framework for planning investment that is focused on blue carbon ecosystems. This is a project. This is work that we did in conjunction with the Due Charity Trust.
Perfecto, tal vez para empezar.
Okay, maybe to start, I would love to explain what is the NDC partnership, maybe for us to understand the perspective that I'm talking from today. NDC partnership is a coalition of countries that are developing. We have development, and also the main organizations or cooperation organisms in the world, NGOs that are working in climate actions are also part of this NDC partnership. And we have the mission of working together to move forward in the expansion of this climate ambition and the implementation of the climate goals. of our countries. And this position allows us to collect and capture many of the experiences of the work, not only of the countries that we work with, but also the associates and many organisms and organizations here present are also part of this, and also governments are part of this NDC partnership. But to tell you maybe a little bit about what is the framework or the way in which we work, we are not the ones implementing. We don't provide financing either. We are facilitators. What we do is to work closely with the governments and provide support to structure their needs for support. After this, the needs are, we take them to the donors or to the NGOs or funders or partners to make sure that these requests of receive the proper financing and the visibility that they deserve. So we focus quite a bit in this, what we call involvement of countries or country engagement. But we also do knowledge management, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Other thing that I want to mention here is the kind of work that we do in regards to financing for the blue carbon ecosystems. And you can see some of the numbers, general numbers of the tendencies of the work that we've been doing in this matter. And if we consider the amount of requests that we receive a year, there are not really that many. And also, the rate of support is also not as high as for now. But this is just 1 year of update for the NDC. NDCs, and many countries have included these blue carbon ecosystems in their NDCs. So we are waiting for multiple requests for working closely with governments to be able to start working the implementation and define the search of these resources for technical assistance for the development of these projects. So more than seeing this as a reality that is not as promising, yeah, we see this as an opportunity for the NDC partnership, the secretary that I'm representing, and also our partners or associates to be prepared, to be ready for the possible increase on requests for support in the related work. You can see some examples of these requests, but I'm not going to get into details. And as I mentioned, we do this engagement with the countries, but we also do knowledge management and very closely with our associates. One of the most active partners in which we work in these two projects of knowledge, and I want to focus on the second one that is called Blue Carbon Ecosystem Supplement. And you might be asking why a supplement. It is a supplement because this document or this product, what it tries to do is to take a look at the planning and mobilization process for the investment of the climate investments from a lens or the perspective of these blue carbon ecosystems. So this means that if the decision makers are not trying to mobilize the investment and planning this investment, what kind of considerations do they need to have? What aspects do they need to pay attention to? And so on, so on. And this is based on the framework for planning and mobilization of these investments that the NDC partnership developing with collaboration with the Green Fund for Climate. It is also important to mention that this is just a knowledge product that has maybe a target that is quite broad, the decision makers in general, but also climate actors and financiers and stakeholders in general. So just anyone that might be interested, really. I don't think that you should be able to read all of this, and I just use a figure that is showing what is this process of planning and mobilization of these investments in the way that is shown in this general framework that I was talking about. It is also important to mention that the development of this framework was not an academic process, maybe intellectual even, to start thinking about what the countries need. And each one of these stages or components that you see within this framework we can get to the experience in our countries and then identify the study cases or these experiences there on the field. So from all the work that our associates or partners have done and also the member countries, we structure this in a logical way. So this process of planning and of investments goes from from upstream, as he says, and it has to do with things that were mentioned today, as for example, the engagement in that is early and significant of these for these stakeholders, aligning the policies, uh, climate change, being reflected in the budgets, and also planning, and also getting down to things that are more involved in the process and topics like the prioritization and identification of investment based on evidence and budgeting, finding the barriers, development of the environments, and preparation and the building of these projects and investments. And I'm going to share the QR code for you to be able to get access to this framework and take a look with a lot more detail if you want to do so. Okay, one thing, and once again, I'm going to focus on all the aspects of this framework of this supplement for these blue carbon ecosystems, but I want to talk about three important topics that Diana and also the colleagues and they yesterday have talked about, and I want to talk about the identification and the how to move towards after the barriers that we have and also the environments that might be enabling and also the mapping of the financing options. And before getting into the matters, I wanted to share these graphics as well, because this is showing what is the challenge that we are facing. You see that there's big efforts, communities, all of you to be able to mobilize investment for to be able to achieve these goals in this blue carbon ecosystem, but the mountain that we need to go to is quite high. We need to multiply the current investments more than 6 times. So it is important that not only we join as an international community, but also that we explore other financing funds and beyond the traditional ones that are being implemented or maybe we record to until now. Okay, when we talk about the investment barriers, I think that it was mentioned quite a bit. What are the barriers? And when we talk about the investment barriers, we have two main types: the systemic barriers and also the ones that are related to projects. The systemic barriers are have to do with infrastructure of the financial systems, the governance schemes, and the macro conditions that actually determine or maybe stop the development of these projects in a way. And we also have the barriers of the projects, the inherent barriers of these projects, and because of the nature, because of the location, the context, these can have some specific barriers that need to be overcome or approached in a way. And I want to summarize the barriers for investments in 3 different categories. The first one is going to be lack of financial resources. It's clear there is not enough resources for some projects for these blue carbon ecosystem projects, especially public resources. And the majority of these resources are coming from external funds, as international funds or multilateral banking. But other thing would be the capacity or institutional capacity. I don't want this to sound as another attack to the consultants or international experts. They have an important role, but within this ecosystem, they have a role. So to what point do we need to create this local capacity? Is it something that we can generate? And this is also an important question that we need to think about, because in many cases, there are conditions that are inherent to the bureaucracy, as for example, voting or other things that maybe stop the creation of these capacities, and we need to think about how can we install these capabilities, generate these capabilities in medium and long term that allow us to plan and to mobilize these investments for these kinds of ecosystems. And another topic that it was mentioned quite a bit is the data and the information and the methodologies. I don't say that I'm an expert on this, and I heard different information about if there's data, if there are methodologies, that there's not enough. at lunch, we were having a conversation, and one of the colleagues mentioned that there's always some kind of data. What we need to do is to know who has it and to be able to use it for the goals of these projects or investments. And there's always going to be data, and there's always going to be an expert that can provide shine some light about any specific context. And I think that we need to think about how the information, plenty or very little that is available for it to go to these decision makers to be used, to not be just hard data and to have an effect really. And also policies, the countries has done some important efforts, Panama, Costa Rica, between others, and to be able to develop these frameworks. But these frameworks, without an application, they are not as useful. And these applications require financial resources to be able to promote or provide this human capital, technology, and others. So all of these barriers are in one way or another present and connected. And how can we overcome these barriers, these hurdles? We need to start developing these enabling conditions, and I don't want to stop quite a bit here, because how can we overcome barriers? For example, the local capabilities. We need to then create these capabilities. We say that very easy, but at the end of the day, what does that mean? Is an important work, and is an amount of work that is extensive and is quite complex. And sadly, the slide is a little bit short at the bottom, but I think it is also very important in terms of policies and actions that are coming from the government. When you talk about subsidies or maybe incentives that could be maybe damaging for the goals of conservation and sustainable handling of these kinds of ecosystems. And many of these incentives for fishing or not really sustainable fishing techniques or agricultural practice in areas that are surrounding these kinds of ecosystems might be kind of sabotage that are these other efforts that are happening around conservation of these ecosystems. And another topic that I would like to talk about briefly is the ownership of the land. I also have conversations on breakfast and also lunch about this, because in many cases, the ownership of this land, of the uncertainty, does not allow to develop the projects in the areas in which they are really a priority or important, and you can see maybe social and climate impact, environmental, and even economical. And these are situations that governments need to face and to see in which ways they can solve these issues to be able to move forward in the development of these projects in zones or areas that might be a priority. And at the last, I want to mention the third point that I mentioned in the introduction is the types of financing. The universe of options here is quite broad. We mentioned carbon markets and other kinds of instruments. I'm not going to do a review of each one of those, but I'm going to do a kind of summary and reflection of the different financing types. But it's important to explore other options that are beyond the carbon markets that are very interesting opportunities. That's true, but there are some other opportunities that we could also use, and we need to combine in a creative manner, I'll say. I think many of you have been working on this kind of financial instrument, and then we can mention the work that is done by PIT and with Blue Economy and instruments such as the Blue guarantees, and also I believe with the Blue bonds, and also in Barbados and other countries with these repayment of debt that have created quite a bit of attention. And it is very important that the decision makers also consider this, because be real catalyzers of other financing types or incomes. And I'm going to talk about these three briefly. And the first one is going to be the domestic and public, basically government budget. If you can see on the first point, this study is showing that around, well, no more than 3% of the total of the budgets are at the global level are assigned or dedicated to the conservation and protection of these kinds of ecosystems. If we consider the impact of the climate potential in terms of mitigation and adaptation and resiliency that these ecosystems have, and also the potential that they have for the improvement of the livelihoods and other types of economic indicators and social indicators, these are really subrepresented and maybe undersupported, I'll say, and these sadly are being undervalued and overexploited, and that would be the way I'll say it. And this is when scientific evidence has a very important role. It is important for us to show the importance of these ecosystems for society, for economy, for climate action, for them to be ecosystems that are even more attractive for investment, be private or multilateral banking or others. And even though that's the case with all the information and with all the technology,
se enfrentan retos para, digamos, justificar o generar casos que motiven a diferentes fuentes de financiamiento, especialmente el sector privado, a involucrarse.
Sorry, this is a bit of an issue with the audio is not coming through the booth. Okay, I'm not going to stop quite a bit here. There is something that is mentioned here, the opportunities for the government and the taxes for fuel, as for example, they do in Costa Rica. They also do the paper services environmental programs. And taxes are not as famous, but they are also an option that is current and something that I'm mentioning, implement subsidies and also to remove other subsidies that might be working against the conservation of these ecosystems. And also 2 other slides. And I want to refer to the financing source, international and public, and especially to the all the multilateral banks for development, as for example, BID, CAF, and also the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, just to mention some in the region, but also the official assistance for development. And possibly you have way more experience in this than me, but we all know the importance of these financing sources to be able to develop and create these enabling conditions to be able to be a catalyzer of other kinds of resources, as for example, grants as mechanisms and policy-based loans, as an example, have been instrumental for the countries on the region to be able to generate these developing conditions that are to allow us to mobilize these public and private resources. And this is the same for the ODAs or the International Climate Funds, and at this point, the UK Blue Carbon Fund as well. And they gave me the design that I'm speaking for too much. I'm going to talk about the market-based sources or these carbon markets, and we maybe talk about them in a bit. There is growing interest about these markets, and there is an opportunity, and it's pretty clear that this market is going to grow. It has created interest in for financiers. It was also mentioned there are other risks associated or maybe challenges that are inherent and that need to be also overcome or approached, and things that have to do with transparency and the distribution of these benefits and the preparation of these projects. I'm going to jump this slide. I'm going to the last one, and just to share these two resources, the Blue Carbon Ecosystem Supplement and also the Climate Investment and Planet Mobilization Framework. Thank you very much for your attention today. I'll stop here.
Muchas gracias al señor.
Okay, and thank you very much, Señor Flores. Mr. Flores, our third panelist is going to join us online is Amy Schmid, that is the leader of the global project for Blue Carbon International Conservation. Mrs. Schmid has nearly a decade of experience in the carbon climate space. She currently leads the initial phase of Blue Carbon Project's assessments and the development of Conservation International, providing technical support and a growing portfolio. Previously, she worked for more than 6 years at Vera, contributing to the development of the overseeing of the global carbon standards methodologies. The title for this presentation is Conservation International Experiences in Developing Blue Carbon Credit Projects. Let's turn our attention back to the screen to hear from Mrs. Mitch.
Hi everyone, my name is Amy Schmid and I'm the Global Blue Carbon Project Lead at Conservation International. Today I'll be giving a presentation about our approach and lessons learned from blue carbon crediting projects. First, I want to say that while I'm not able to be there in person with you, I'm very grateful to be able to share our work virtually, and I want to thank the meeting organizers for making this possible. At CI, our mission with our blue carbon program is to use blue carbon value to increase and accelerate the restoration and conservation of coastal ecosystems for climate mitigation and adaptation. I think all of us understand the great value that these ecosystems provide, both with the carbon that they store and sequester, but also the value that they provide for local communities in terms of economic benefits and also adaptation or resilience to climate change impacts. And so we see that there is a real opportunity to use their carbon value to bring in finance and funding in order to restore and protect them kind of more and faster. At CI, our blue carbon program includes a number of pillars. The first is being a leader in developing the science. So CI has been involved with blue carbon science by leading different publications, as well as leading various initiatives and alliances to advance our work. We also work closely with piloting crediting projects, including the Vida Manglar project in Santa Marta, Colombia, and we're now working to repeat our efforts to find other crediting project opportunities in more than 15 countries around the world. And finally, we work closely to enable policy change, both to create enabling conditions for crediting projects, but also to ensure that policies can be developed to support the restoration and protection of these important ecosystems with or without funding from crediting. So as I mentioned, today I'll be focusing on our role and our experience with blue carbon crediting development. And so CI has a number of different roles that we play with crediting projects. The first is by leading these projects directly, so both with our global teams working closely to develop some of the carbon components of the project, as well as with local teams working to implement the projects on the ground. We also work with partners in cases or in countries where we may not have a local team on the ground, or where a partner is doing that on-the-ground implementation instead, but where CI can still add a lot of value and have a role over the lifetime of the project in ensuring high quality in kind of the carbon project development and implementation. And lastly, in some cases, we act as more of a technical advisor, coming in at different stages of project development to provide input and ensure high quality during that relationship. And so no matter what our role is in the project, we strive to ensure the highest quality and ensuring that projects follow high quality criteria for climate, environmental, and social co-benefits. As I mentioned, one example of a crediting project that we've been involved with is the Vida Manglar project in Santa Marta, Colombia. And the Vida Manglar project is the first project that was registered and issued credits using one of Vera's blue carbon specific methodologies. It's a conservation project along the Colombian Caribbean coastline. that aims to protect and reduce deforestation of mangroves within a protected area there. CI is one partner among a number of other partners, including Invamar, the Omacha Foundation, and CVS, which is the local environmental authority, and all working together to ensure implementation of activities to reduce deforestation, improve management of the mangrove area, deliver benefits to local communities, and deliver verified carbon credits. So the project has started to deliver a number of benefits. In terms of the climate benefit, we are expecting to reduce emissions from mangrove deforestation by a little less than 1 million tons of CO2 over the 30-year project lifetime. And the project is expected to run officially through 2045, though will continue beyond that, hopefully. We were able to verify almost 70,000 tons of reduced emissions from the first monitoring period, and we're currently going through the project's second verification now of the 2019 to 2023 monitoring period. And after that, we should have additional credits that we can sell and then use the revenue to reinvest back into the project. In terms of community and social benefits, there are nearly 1,800 people that are impacted positively by the project. And within kind of the community line, we work to strengthen local capacity for local management of the mangroves, as well as implementing alternative productive activities, including ecotourism with bird watching and a crocodile rehabilitation facility, starting community orchards, and doing training on beekeeping with native bees and native honey. And finally, for the biodiversity component of the project, we are working to conserve mangroves and ensure the hydrological connectivity. And so having benefits not only for the mangroves, but also for many of the species that rely on them, including manatees, otters, and the needle-nosed cottontail. And so from our experience with the Vida Manglar project, we are, as I mentioned, working to find other locations where similar projects could be replicated and other crediting projects could be developed. And so as a current snapshot of our blue carbon pipeline, we are looking at projects in the Americas, Africa, and Asia Pacific. And kind of within this spanning mostly crediting projects, but also looking at some non-crediting opportunities. Most of the projects that we're currently looking at are also focused on mangroves, but we do have a couple that are focused either on seagrass restoration or salt marsh restoration and conservation. And so I wanted to start talking through some of the lessons that we've learned from our experience, not only with the Vida Manglar project, but also our experience kind of scoping and doing feasibility assessments for projects in many other locations. And to do this, I wanted to start by giving an overview of some of the different components of a carbon crediting project to make sure that we're all on the same page and have kind of a baseline understanding of what these different terms mean for a crediting project. So the first is the concept of additionality. And at a really high level, additionality means, would the project activity have happened without the additional finance provided by the credit sales? And so usually this also takes into account whether the project activity is required by law or required by a regularly enforced law. The next concept is around the baseline scenario, and this is establishing what would happen in the absence of the project activity. So oftentimes this can be kind of continuation of what was happening before the project. So for example, in a reduced deforestation project, you might say that nothing is going to change and kind of deforestation will continue to happen. But it's an important scenario to set out because it's what you compare your emission reductions or carbon sequestration with to ultimately calculate the number of carbon credits a project may be eligible to issue. The next concept is the greenhouse gas boundary, and this is which greenhouse gas emissions and carbon stocks are you including in your monitoring and quantification. Usually for blue carbon projects, this includes CO2 emissions, and in some cases can include methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And for carbon stocks, usually above ground and below ground biomass and soil organic carbon, though in certain cases, other carbon pools like leaf litter or dead wood can also be included. The project activities are the activities that are actually being done to either restore or protect the blue carbon ecosystems. And so I'll get into more of what this might mean specifically for different sites, but really broadly, it's kind of restoration or protection of a blue carbon ecosystem. Monitoring is important for any carbon credit project to set out how you're measuring the impacts of project activities. In most, if not all cases, carbon credits are issued based on emission reductions and removals that have actually occurred. And so it's important to monitor those impacts in order to accurately quantify your emission reductions and removals and be able to issue credits. And the quantification is the process and the calculations done to actually calculate how many emission reductions or removals the project activity has generated. This is something that the specific details are set out in a methodology that a project would need to follow. And lastly, but certainly not least, safeguards are a very important consideration for any natural climate solutions crediting project, but ensuring proper community engagement and equitable and fair benefit sharing. Again, at a really high level for kind of all of these concepts, and we could probably have long days and long presentations digging into each one. So within blue carbon crediting, I will focus mostly on the voluntary market. And what I have on the screen now is kind of a list of some of the more widely used or well-known greenhouse gas programs that include blue carbon crediting methodologies. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list. There are kind of new greenhouse gas programs popping up. There are some like regional or more local methodologies that are being developed, but these are some of like the bigger or more well-known programs. And so from what's on the screen, you might be able to see that most of the methodologies will only cover mangroves. The Verified Carbon Standard or VCS methodology is the only one that includes conservation and restoration of all three blue carbon ecosystem types, including mangroves, seagrass, and saltmarsh. Plan Vivo currently has a blue carbon methodology that's under development that will initially cover conservation and restoration of mangroves, and they're planning to incorporate seagrass in a future development round. And then the Gold Standard and Climate Action Reserve both have methodologies that cover mangrove restoration or reforestation, but don't include conservation or the other blue carbon ecosystems at this time. And so as I mentioned, kind of for each of those concepts that I covered in the previous slide, the specific methodology will set out kind of the specific requirements that a project might need to follow. But in general, they all touch on very similar concepts, and it's kind of the details that might differ. And so going through the process to develop a blue carbon project, we first start with initial site identification or kind of site scoping. And so this is looking at an area that might need conservation or restoration, or prioritizing the areas that might have the most potential for that. and then starting to look at the drivers of ecosystem loss or activities that could be implemented to see if it's worthwhile to kind of move into a full feasibility assessment. And the full feasibility assessment includes more site-specific information, starting community outreach, and really starting to estimate some of the carbon benefits that could be created by doing activities in that location, and basically seeing if it's feasible to successfully implement activities and if there would be a financial benefit from developing a crediting project for that. Once a project is feasible, then you can move into project development and carbon project description development. And so for project development, it's really about designing the project and finalizing project design. So not only the activities that you'll implement for reducing emissions from ecosystem conversion or increasing carbon sequestration from restoration, but also looking at potential biodiversity and social benefits and making sure to design a project that will kind of encompass all of those aspects. It would also include starting to implement some of those activities and creating a financial plan to ensure that the project can be financially sustainable over the long term. And the carbon project description is what's required by the greenhouse gas programs, and this kind of compiles all of the information about project design, the carbon project components, and demonstrating how the project will meet the requirements of the greenhouse gas program. And then for credit issuance, there is a validation and verification process that a project would need to go through in order to officially issue and sell credits and then reinvest funding from the sale of credits back into the project. And so as I've been talking, I've been mentioning the conservation and restoration of ecosystems as activities eligible for crediting. And so specifically by this for blue carbon ecosystems, this would be restoration of degraded or previously converted tidal wetland ecosystems, or the conservation or protection of tidal wetland ecosystems that are at threat of conversion or degradation. And so now I'll walk through some of the questions that we have found to be important when we are scoping different project sites. So for restoration sites, we're looking at whether the site was a converted or degraded blue carbon ecosystem. It's important to understand how long ago it was converted or degraded and what caused that conversion or degradation. It's also important to understand if there are continuing barriers to restoration. For example, why is the area not naturally regenerating? We know that in many cases, when the conditions are right, blue carbon ecosystems are really good at growing where they naturally grow. So it's important to understand why they might not be doing that. And then it's also important to consider, can activities be implemented to successfully address those identified barriers? For a conservation site, we're looking at intact tidal wetland ecosystems, and we need to establish whether they are at threat of conversion or degradation. So some of the things to look at are, what is the rate of wetland loss in the region? What are the drivers of wetland conversion, and can those drivers be successfully mitigated? Because blue carbon ecosystems are hydrologically connected, we need to consider both direct drivers that act directly within or on the blue carbon ecosystem and indirect drivers which impact the blue carbon ecosystem, but they may not directly act on it. So for example, a direct driver might be cutting down mangroves to convert the area into aquaculture or shrimp ponds, or harvesting mangroves for charcoal or timber. And an example of some indirect drivers could be infrastructure that changes tidal flow. So for example, the construction of roads or dams that cut off tidal flow to the blue carbon ecosystem, or upstream changes in sediment supply or water quality that impact the blue carbon ecosystem. So to address the drivers of conversion, it's really important to accurately identify what those drivers are. In some cases, you might have direct drivers and indirect drivers acting within the same ecosystem. And if you only address kind of one set of those, you won't be successfully protecting the ecosystem. Once you understand the identified drivers, you can develop a theory of change to help design activities that will successfully address those drivers and then implement those activities. One thing to note is that indirect drivers of wetland conversion can be more difficult to fully address compared to direct drivers. So in many cases, the cause of the indirect driver can be, really disconnected from the wetland ecosystem that's being impacted. And also it can be a much more dispersed driver. So for example, if it's something like pollution, it can be difficult to, fully stop upstream pollution that's impacting this wetland. And although it's difficult, it's not impossible in all cases. Additionally, it's really important to start looking at kind of social and environmental safeguards from an early stage. So even understanding how many people live in or near the blue carbon ecosystem, how have or do they use the resources, and starting to incorporate local and traditional knowledge into your project design. Additionally, it's important kind of from the beginning to think about developing an equitable and fair benefit sharing mechanism together with the communities and the people that will be involved in the project. And for environmental considerations, from protection and restoration of ecosystems, we can often assume that we'll have a benefit, but it's important to kind of ensure that that benefit will happen for any biodiversity objectives you may have. And so a good kind of starting point is to understand what species live within or depend on the blue carbon ecosystem, and how could any changes that you're implementing be affecting those species. And lastly, it's important to consider kind of the legal and policy landscape of wherever you're working. So carbon rights can be occasionally challenging to establish for blue carbon ecosystems, but it's important to understand who legally owns or controls the project area. This can be an individual, it can be government, agencies, and it can be more than one person or entity, and we do see that in a lot of cases with blue carbon specifically. It's also important to understand whether the landowner or landowners also own the carbon. In many cases they do, in some cases they don't, and in many cases it's unclear. And then lastly, it's important to consider whether anyone other than the legal landowner has rights to or traditional use of the project area or its resources, to make sure that you are taking those kind of traditional ownership rights into account as well. And for policy, for a voluntary carbon project, it's very important to know whether the country allows voluntary carbon credit trading and whether there's a compliance market in place instead. And then also whether the country includes blue carbon or the ecosystem that you're working in within its NDC, and any implications that that might have, whether they require corresponding adjustment or not, for example. And so that is a lot of information about blue carbon, like site scoping and what you might need to look for a crediting project. And some of the challenges that we've identified with our work specific to blue carbon include the scale and location. So blue carbon ecosystems tend to be smaller than many terrestrial ecosystems like forests, and they also are located in typically more heavily populated coastal zones. So this can mean that if a project is too small, it's challenging to make it financially feasible due to the cost of crediting project development. And having a higher population might mean that you need to do more community engagement or community engagement with more people. However, that's also an opportunity because it means that a project could have benefits for a higher population and for more people. Another challenge that's specific to blue carbon is that they are incredibly dynamic systems, and it can make tracking and accounting for the carbon fluxes more challenging than other natural climate solutions. For example, by needing to take into account projected impacts from sea level rise or coastal erosion, and understand that the carbon that is currently within the system might not always be there due to some of those impacts. And lastly, as I mentioned, blue carbon ecosystems are often owned or controlled by one or more government entities or one or more entities. And so it can be sometimes more difficult to need to kind of align with multiple different agencies or multiple different entities to agree on carbon ownership, project development, and benefit sharing, not only with local communities, but also potentially with benefit sharing with the government. So none of these challenges are insurmountable, but they do make it, in certain cases, more difficult to find sites that are really well suited to crediting project development. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you again for listening. I'm sorry that I can't be at the conference in person, but if you have any questions or want to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'd be happy to chat. Thank you very much.
Antes de continuar, queremos recordarles que
we want to announce there is a meeting for the community of practice during a lunch time. So please, as we finish here, you can please address the meeting. Now we're going to have a panel that's going to be moderated by Dr. Tobias Jackson. Please join us on stage. Together with Diána Denke and Adrián Flores, this panel will focus on financing opportunities for blue carbon.